We were barreling toward Portobello Road in a cold winter downpour, headed for an arcade I'd been tipped about by my friend, the antiquarian Alexander Die Carcassite. Mr. Allardyce was griping about change. The peculiarities and quirks of his 1960s childhood, he said, had given way to the blight of Center City sameness. When I was a boy you could still see all them little shops, streets of specialty shops, Mr. Allardyce told me. Back then, Columbia Market, today a place of open-air flower stalls and hipster brunch spots, was where East End families shopped for pet guinea pigs, kittens, dogs, snakes, rabbits, Mr. Allardyce said. They even had goats. The image delights me, a goat cropping grass in central London. It summons up both England's agrarian soul and also a capital city in which little-known spaces, odd corners and crooked byways have always had their place. It speaks to me of quiddity, that ineffable quality of whatness. People have it, places, too. Manhattan certainly used to, though I'm not convinced of that anymore. This is partly why I had booked the recent trip to London, because while the goats may be gone, the quiddity remains. It is woven into the city's texture, in its arcades, its shoulder-wide alleys, odd terraces, house museums and specialty shops, secreted between and beside and atop and sometimes even within the big market attractions, hidden right there in plain sight. Jet-lagged and awake too early to visit the Tate Modern on an earlier visit in October, I had decided to kill time by walking there from my hotel near Buckingham Palace and along the sinuous South Bank. Passing Westminster Abbey on my way, I'd spontaneously drop in on a 7:30 a.m. service held in a side chapel austere enough to pass for a rock church in Jerusalem. Away from the gilt and bombast of the Abbey's lofty 14th-century nave, there were perhaps 30 others on hand that day, from among the millions of visitors to England last year, each of us partaking of an experience intimate, profoundly universal and available to anyone. Moments like this abound in London. And it does no disservice to the Tower or Buckingham Palace or the London Eye to forego the long lines and the touristic must-sees and practice instead some urban idling, the Flannery Balzac termed the gastronomy of the eye. Walter Benjamin more famously characterized the flop nerd as an essential urban figure, an amateur detective and investigator of urbanity. Predicting that rampant consumer capitalism would eventually spell doom for a flop nerd's pleasures, Benjamin also neatly anticipated Billy Allardyce's gripe, and my own. Yet wandering around London lately, alone or in the company of friends like Giles Waterfield, a novelist and lecturer at the Courtauld Institute of Art, or the art historian Haydn Williams, I have bumbled upon wonders like the Denis Severs House Museum, 18 Falgate Street, a fanatically detailed recreation by an expatriated American of house of a family of Huguenot silk weavers as it might have evolved over centuries. A place of guttering candles, of objects in mad profusion, of pomanders and drying laundry hung from rafters. The place could easily lapse into twee were it not for the force of Severs' artistic vision, which leaves the visitor feeling as if a door had opened into some mad aesthete's sensorium. Exploring with Mr. Waterfield one afternoon, I discovered the York Watergate, the baroque stone pile attributed to Inigo Jones, and a centuries-old pub that retains its anachronistic charm despite being on every list of tourist attractions. On my own I visited a hushed room in the British Museum where Chinese ceramics amassed by a wealthy collector over a lifetime confirmed that England is indeed Europe's attic. Serenely displayed in room 95 at the museum are some 1,700 objects from the collection of Sir Percival David, a 20th-century businessman who amassed the ceramics with a cultivated eye and singular determination. Established in 1952 at the University of London, the Percival David Foundation of Chinese Art was until 2007 kept in a Georgian house on Gordon Square. It then moved on long-term loan to the British Museum, where it was reorganized and displayed in considerable splendor with a grant from a Hong Kong businessman. Glass case after glass case there is packed with blue and white and ox blood and yellow and jade green ceramics, a volume of objects so overwhelming that when I visited in October I walked in fact right out. This time before setting off, I sought help from Jessica Harrison Hall, curator of the Chinese ceramics collection, hoping for guidance on what to look out for, keeping in mind the cardinal rule of art appreciation: see the best first while the eye is fresh. Without hesitation Miss Harrison Hall directed me to Case 2, where is arrayed a small grouping of objects glazed an indefinable color, something between lavender blue and celadon green. Experts consider ruthenium ware the acme of Chinese ceramics. For the whole of Chinese history, they have tried to recreate these ceramics and this glaze, Miss Harrison Hall told me. There exist perhaps 100 examples of these refined Song dynasty objects, made around the time Normans were pillaging England, in the world. 12 are in the British Museum. 7 are in this case. Wonderful imitations were made in the Qing and Ming dynasties, Miss Harrison Hall added, and yet nothing quite approaches the fineness of, say, the scholar's brush washer in the British Museum, the small bowl in size with a pair of the fish that in China symbolize abundance, the words for fish and abundance having a similar sound. On the day I visited the museum I pressed through the mobs crowding around the so-called Elgin marbles and the uninspiring lump of the Rosetta Stone, climbed the stairs to room 95 and opened the heavy glass doors to find that I had the gallery to myself. More and more it seems my ambition as a traveler is to discover quiet and untrammeled places, anything to get away from the relentless thumb-tappers and the acoustic herd. London differs little from New York in that sense. You see plenty of sheep clumped behind a leader with a flag at the end of a want. Yet, perhaps because the city is so old, large, decentralized and layered, it is likelier there to visit some certified cultural attraction and find that you have it all to yourself. I experienced this again when I headed to Holland Park and the Leighton House Museum, a startlingly radical house built by a leading light of Victorian painting. When Sir Frederick Leighton constructed his opulent house in the 1860s with an important later extension, the view from his dining room window was of farmland, the piggery and parkland stretching away to the north. The colony of prosperous artists grew up around it, the so-called studio houses of the Holland Park Circle. Many remain in what is now an expensive residential area, Leighton House standing among them as an unlikely relic of a period and style that somehow survived the vagaries of fashion. The first part of the house was built in a blocky, restrained classical style to the designs of George Acheson and is of mild historic interest to a traveler, notable mainly for its functional segregation, servants below ground, a separate entrance and stair for Leighton's models, only one bedroom in a vast structure, for the master himself. What makes the house modern, Warholian, and even, is how it evolved to accommodate the artist's singular mania for collecting, in particular the antique Islamic tiles he and his purchasing agents ransacked the Middle East to acquire in the middle of the 19th century. By the time Leighton conceived the idea of building an opulent domed and columned Arab hall, he'd amassed thousands of tiles stripped from mosques and tombs and houses in Syria, Turkey and Iran. The visitor coming off the street and through the drab reception area, formerly the breakfast room into Leighton House, is thus plunged into an Orientalist delirium. Satsuma vases, scholars' rocks, a stuffed peacock perched on a railing, and the Arab hall itself, a chamber whose blue tile panels, Genoa marble columns, gilded friezes and domed skylight were brought together, it would seem, to stun the viewer into aesthetic submission, the Victorian version of shock and awe. Leighton House had the happy effect on me of stoking the desire to understand the Victorians and their crass, dynamic and rumbustious period better, an ambition achieved in London with ease. One reason for this is the existence of the Great British Library. Another is the persistence of the independent booksellers that in London, unlike New York, have miraculously survived the internet. Whenever in town I had by habit to the famous G. They Would Kill Limited bookstore on Curzon Street, at least in part for the pleasure of conjuring up an image of Nancy Mitford during the wartime years when she worked there as a clerk. On my trip last October, though, my pal Hatton Williams urged me to visit John Sandoe Books Limited, in Chelsea, a suggestion that eventually cost me plenty in overweight luggage fees. When John Sandoe founded John Sandoe Books Limited in 1957, the premises housed a poodle grooming parlor, a junk shop and a secretarial agency. Mr. Sandoe ran the store until his retirement in 1989, when the employees bought it from him, continuing to run it along the same unorthodox business principles. This is to say that crammed into 3 stories of the 18th century structure at John Sandoe Books Limited are books stacked on tables, on the floor, on the risers of the corkscrew stairway and shelved in places 2 or more deep. There are 24,320 volumes, 22,790 of them single copies, at last count, said Dan Fenton, one of 3 current owners of the store. We leave things on shelves much longer than accountants at chain stores would have you do it, regardless of whether they are going to sell in 2 years," Mr. Fenton remarked, pushing aside a pile of books to make room for the one I was busy creating. In it stood the hairy Orientalist novel baked by the great art collector and patron William Beckford, copies of Jane Gardam's wonderful old filth bought as presents for friends, the collected letters of the Sicilian Duke, unexpected Anglophile and genius Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa, every available reprint of the diaries of James Leesmel, a man the famed art historian Bernard Berenson once characterized with a typical lack of charity as rather stern, melancholy, youngish-oldish James Leesmel, Secretary of Society for the Preservation of Country Seats. Leesmel was far more than that, of course, the diarist snob whose observations on the inherently peculiar folkways of the English upper class remain, as Larry McMurtry once pointed out in the New York Review of Books, an irresistible form of parade literary catnip, his asperity useful in depicting the gods of the hour and their inevitable feet of clay. You might wish he'd been around to describe Thomas Carlyle, the philosopher, biographer, satirist and coiner of deathless neologisms. Sincerity, manhunt, self-help and giggly are his and his wife, Jane. Happily this pair of lubomaniacs did a pretty good job for themselves. As 19th-century literary celebrities, the Carlyles courted fame and fled from it to their tidy house in Chelsea. Don Chaney wrote, just down from François Pinault's two-bedroom West house, for which the billionaire paid $32 million in 2011, is the snug four-story dwelling where Carlyle wrote many of his masterworks and behind which lies a modest garden patch. There stands the family's birth closet and there Carlyle buried his wife's dog, Nero, tragically done in by a butcher's cart. In this house Thomas and Jane Carlyle wrote voluminously, renovated incessantly and quarreled without stop. They fought with contractors, with noisily musical neighbors, with the benighted servants, 34 of them in 32 years, and notoriously with each other. Not for the Carlyles, 19th century forerunners of the Bickersons, the love-struck poetic mooning of the Brownings. Could you for instance sleep in a double-bedded room with Carlyle? Jane Carlyle, one of history's great correspondents, inquired in a letter to her cousin Jeannie Welsh. The question was rhetorical. It was pouring again on the weekday morning of my visit, and again I had a historic property to myself. Now owned by the National Trust, Carlyle's house is, like other such properties, occupied by a caretaker couple whose presence imparts life to what might otherwise feel like a fusty reliquary. The wife tends a garden. The husband makes placards with quotations from Carlyle, the writer Matthew Arnold described as part man of genius, part fanatic and part tomfool, scattering them around on the furniture. My favorite bit of Carlyle wisdom on display derived from a letter written to an aspiring novelist. A good book should have the water carefully roasted out of it, Carlyle advised Elizabeth Gaskell. Brevity, veracity, concision are the law and the prophets for the writer, Carlyle added, ignoring his own advice to win bag on for several long paragraphs before signing off with kind respects and thanks. It seemed somehow fitting on that cold, drizzly day to continue in a time-stop vein, so I taxied across town to Fleet Street and Ye Old Cheshire Cheese, a venerable pub whose warren of small rooms has attracted as patrons everyone from Samuel Johnson to Mark Twain. Presumably they were drawn there by an atmosphere that surely felt ye old even when the pub was ye new, and by the obvious truth that a steak and kidney pie, a pint of Samuel Smith and an hour beside a fire works better than anything to ward off London's chill and gloom. To be clear about this, I am no history reenactor. I savor a hot new restaurant as well as the next guy, and on that particular trip scored the coveted reservation at the Delaunay, a place that the publisher-philanthropist Lady Eleanor Foster recently pronounced, with imperturbable assurance, as the obvious successor to the more famous Wolseley, although that is no stretch considering both were created by Jeremy King and Chris Corbin, the wizards of neo-retro restaurants. Over plates of Carlingford Lock Rock oysters, schnitzel and roast potatoes and plentiful white burgundy, the friend and I spent an entirely pleasurable evening at the Delaunay, after which we set off on foot along the Strand. 5 minutes into our walk, we were accosted by a merry group of students, well lubricated and arrayed in costume. Although I vaguely recall someone mentioning the fancy dress party, and possibly even university admissions, I never quite got to the bottom of why, in the middle of winter, this group of women and men were attired in Halloween finery. Well, what matter? I put it down to London quiddity and pulled out an penny for a souvenir self-pick. And there I am, wedged between a Titian-haired harlot with bee-stung lips and a bruiser with rugby thighs encased in white tights, broad chest straining the buttons of a shirtwaist, crew-cut crown by a starched white nurse's cap. Cheat sheet. Editing London as I did is a challenge and probably works only if you've been there before. Though I skirted the beaten track, I did not altogether avoid it. The British Museum is nobody's idea of a secret. But by planning carefully and securing advance reservations at places like the Denis Severs House 18 Vulgate Street, denissevershouse.co.uk, I managed to spend 5 days discovering the odd byways of the city at an unhurried pace. Where I stayed, I put up, as I typically do, at the Crown Plaza, a 4-star on a quiet side street in central London near Buckingham Palace. crownplaza.com. How I got around. That the areas I covered, Portobello Road, Chelsea, Holland Park, Fleet Street, the East End, are at considerable distance from one another should not be a problem for avid walkers. To traverse distances too far to walk, I bought a preloaded tube card and a map. I also indulged in London's exorbitant taxis. They make New York seem free, at night. Where I ate. My unimaginative default for modestly priced eating tended to be noodle or sandwich chains like Wagamama or Pret a Manger, though Tom's Kitchen at Somerset House, tomskitchen.co.uk/Somerset, has hearty and well-priced offerings for weekend brunch and daily lunches, focusing on fresh British meats and produce. For a culinary splash out, I booked at the Middle Europa-themed Delana Eat at delanaeat.com, where with wine, tax and tip, dinner for two cost roughly $300. I also made good use of the takeout counters at Fortnum and Mason's basement, whose wine department has offerings at every level of price. Keep in mind, timings can be fluky at places like the Carlyle's House, open Wednesday to Sunday starting March 9th. Check the website nationaltrust.org.uk first. Be sure, too, to sample the online archive of Jane Carlyle's voluminous correspondence. Once you've read one of her sharply observed and witty letters, you'll be ashamed to write LOL or OMG ever again.